Richard Tice, Deputy Leader of Reform UK. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you. First time.
First time, and hopefully the first time of many. Now,
I'll try to behave.
We'll see what we can do now. You've described speaking up for Israel and the Jewish community in Parliament as, quotes, the hardest thing to do. Why have we arrived at this time where this sort of impulse of self-censorship seems to pervade absolutely every part? You have to show a bit of courage to tell the truth.
Correct. And it's very sad, but it's the truth is that the House of Commons is predominantly full of very anti-Israel. I regret to say in certain numerous occasions, instances, anti-Semitic MPs. And that's the simple reality. And then I've got the four pro-Gaza MPs also sitting right behind. So whenever I try and stand up and promote Israel and attack the things like UNRWA being riddled with Hamas sympathizers, it's pretty uncomfortable. So that's just the simple reality of the situation we have. And we do our best.
It seems to me, as a fellow Israel supporter, that anyone who believes the narrative, as we've seen so frequently on the government's front benches, David Lammy, is that they are victims of a media narrative that actually they can't be very wise up on critical thinking if they come to those conclusions at all times.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is there's almost like a competition in the Commons amongst the various parties, except Reform, except the DUP. The Conservatives, some of them are supportive, some of them are not, bluntly. But there's a competition as to who can use the word sort of child killer, genocide, more often in a more dramatic way. And there is a almost complete absence of the suggestion that maybe the bad guys are Hamas. Maybe if Hamas actually gave all of the hostages back, then this would stop. It's not rocket science. It's sort of back to where things were some time ago, and that just by that side hardly ever gets raised. Also, it hardly ever gets raised by any of these people. Well, what does the future look like? And that the fact that the future can only look like in any vague direction towards peace is if Hamas have no role in governing Gaza. I mean, that's been obvious to me for a very long time. And yet that is just something people rarely want to go to. And I am deeply, deeply suspicious to the point that I think something is very wrong with this obsession with UNRWA, this complete misinformation. They're the only organization that can provide humanitarian aid, and they're doing a brilliant job, and that none of their humanitarian aid gets nicked, that none of their people are Hamas supporters. And I don't know how this has happened, but there is just a degree of seeping misinformation has permeated, I think, from the UN itself down. And I actually had quite a row, you may have seen, with Robert Peston the other week, when the US came forward with a different humanitarian plan that was endorsed by Israel, talk about bringing in trusted private contractors. And I took the view, look, if it's endorsed by Israel, then it's got a much better chance, frankly, of happening. And if the US wants to make it happen, you don't get two more powerful entities to make something happening than the US and Israel working together. So I said, at the very least, why wouldn't you give it a go? Why would you dismiss it out of hand as not even worth the candle of a discussion or an experiment? And that made me, do you know what? That actually made me a great deal more suspicious. And I think that certain people at the UN behaved disgracefully in dismissing that out of hand, as I think of many governments. I think there's trying to find the right, there's a coalition of protection around UN humanitarian aid agencies and UNRWA, who frankly very often are little more than useless.
On a more serious level, we have seen the murder in cold blood of 2 Washington consulate officials outside a Jewish museum. The sort of attacks which the Jewish diaspora live in fear of every hour of every day. Outside of our schools and our synagogues and community centres, we have professional and amateur muscle patrolling, basically. I am one of those people. I patrol my school with other parents on a voluntary basis. Lord knows how I would leap into action. God forbid if something would happen, but I do my very best. How much do you think the joint statement of Starmer, Macron and Carney and the like, who seem to have taken on the baton from Biden, which kind of says Israel can defend itself, but not so much, just a bit. How much do you think that translates, that rhetoric and statements translate into these terrible crimes?
The honest answer, John, is I don't know that specific question. I've got to be honest. But there is, all I can say is for the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, they are looking over both shoulders, forwards and backwards. They're terrified by the progress of reform. They're terrified by their pro-Gaza, deeply Marxist stroke communist left-wing supporters on the other side, who I'm afraid just are, they're just anti-Semitic. We just got to call it out. We know the Labour Party's historic, awful track record on anti-Semitism. And so they're playing politics with this. And as you quite rightly said about that horrific incident, I sent my condolences privately to the Israeli embassy here in the UK this morning. And yeah, it's impossible to imagine. And you sort of see it, the truth is out when the murderer who assassinated those 2 young people then describes sort of free Palestine. So in a sense, I took a lot of flack when I said we should ban all of these pro-Gaza, I call them pro-Hamas marches, free Palestine marches. And actually, I think that horrific murder proves ever more that those of us who criticise those marches, they shouldn't take place. They incite hatred and anti-Semitism. Not everybody there, of course. There's lots of naive people who don't really understand what on earth is going on. But the bottom line is there are far too many people who have bad, evil intent. And it's just utterly appalling in every sense.
I have some policy ideas for the potential of a reform London mayor that perhaps we can talk about privately or at another time.
Let's do that.
Well, Sadiq Khan is definitely upping the temperature of living in London amongst certain communities, not just the Jewish communities, but the Hindu community as well, and any community which stands up against Islamism or is in the front line against it, who doesn't fight against it per se. Now, of course, we know that Reform UK's brand values, amongst many other things, are emphasising British culture and values. How do you go about consolidating and ensuring that Jewish and cultural religious practices are protected and integrated within that vision?
I think it's a great question. I'd just sort of say a few things. First of all, we've got to keep standing up for Israel whenever possible. And just to explain, I try and say something in Parliament when I can, but it's not always possible because we're obviously still quite a small group of parliamentarians. We're charging around trying to sort of do the work of 3 people for every one of us. So, but whenever I can, I try and say something in Parliament. We've got to keep talking. I was talking in a synagogue just a couple of Sundays ago, and I think we need to increase that close liaison. Hopefully word is spreading about the depth of our support. And then I think we've just got to reinforce that all of us of any religion, any faith or no faith should be able to enjoy the great British values, the incredible fortune of living in the UK, in particular living in a great city like London that's not as great as it was, sadly, in safety, and with the strong belief that law and order and security forces and police are not far away, and that if you called them, they might actually do the right thing and show up pretty rapidly, and that any transgressions that break the law are properly dealt with, and that there is a deterrent through the sentencing system. And all of those things at the moment, I regret to say, most of those things are at best under question, at worst not available or under real serious threat.
I'm going to talk about common law here as part of British values. And we have seen on social media some very, very ugly statements. I had one from Ian Dale, which I think is absolutely unforgivable if he calls himself a Tory. He said, we should ban halal and kosher food, end of. That's what he said. He's supposed to be a Tory who presumably would support common law. And then, I don't want to talk too much about Rupert Lowe, but Rupert Lowe said, oh, let's ban halal. And of course, the elephant in the room is, well, what do you do with kosher? The idea is that with kosher food, it doesn't harm the wider population. It's just part of religious practice, and British values are entitled everyone to practice their values whilst communing around British values. Where do you think you can rein in perhaps some of the more extreme members of Reform that perhaps don't recognise some of the British values that perhaps you would espouse personally? Because that is something that I worry about in Reform, but in Labour and Tory as well, actually.
Well, I would hope that isn't the position in Reform. It's certainly not that I'm aware, but and obviously Rupert Lowe is no longer a member of Reform, so I'd just clarify that. But obviously we've got whatever it is, 230 odd thousand members and millions of people voting. So I can't be held responsible for everybody's sort of statement on social media. And I guess, on the one hand, we aspire to free speech. So, I mean, everybody's entitled to say sort of something, even if it's offensive, vile, and horrific, as long as here's the point where I draw the line is that as long as it doesn't inspire hate and illegal, for example, anti-Semitism. That's where I draw the line. So, and I think these, whether or not people find them tasteful or distasteful, we are a tolerant nation that generally we sort of say, look, quietly get about your business, whatever that is, as long as it's within the law, then crack on. Of course, we should try and avoid being sort of antisocial and selfish in our behaviour that winds other people up next to us. That's a sort of British value of courtesy and good manners, rather than anything else. So, and a slightly less serious example is, when you're on a train carriage and someone's blasting out the music, well, why don't they use headphones rather than blasting out the music on their phone and or sort of putting your feet on the bench and preventing someone. Those are sort of British values, British manners, and I think that's part of who we are. It's part of that sense of it's not cricket, and Britain invented cricket. It's sort of what we stand for. It's sort of who we are. And I know it's a bit quaint, but I think actually that's one of the reasons why so many people, and I hope, including the Jewish community, feel that there's something quite unique about British values and living in the UK.
I must tell you, as you well know, that every Jewish grouping of people that goes out counter-protesting, not protesting, but counter-protesting against the noise of the Palestinian protests always is accompanied by the Union flag, because we regard ourselves in partnership of the endeavours of the British people. I was brought up in that. Our synagogue and every synagogue around the country makes a small prayer for the royal family every Shabbat morning, and for the welfare of its councillors, that they deal kindly and truly with all Israel. And I always think of Starmer and Lammy as we utter those words, because they are our current councillors. obviously, you've spoken against Sharia law and free mixing proposals by other politicians. So, with issues where there may be crossover, I mean, the Beth Din and Sharia are kind of different organizations, but how does Reform UK's rejection of such measures reassure Jewish voters about their place in British society?
Well, I think we were the only political party, certainly at the last election, I don't know previously, who actually specifically put it in our equivalent of a manifesto, what we call a contract. I said Sharia law should have no place in the United Kingdom. And I put it in there and we meant it. I mean, we operate under one legal system, which is English law, which is probably the most respected legal system around the world. And it seems to work pretty well. Well, I mean, it should work pretty well. It takes too long and costs too much. But nevertheless, it is a trusted legal system. So, that's the beginning and end of it. And, our foundation as a nation is Christianity. And we have to stand up for that strongly, robustly, in every sense. I think what's happened is, over the last 20 years, we as a nation in many areas, including in this area, we became a bit almost too successful. We became a bit decadent, a bit complacent, partly out of success in the 80s and 90s. Things went well. Generally, people were getting a bit more prosperous. Life was good. And what happens then is it's too easy to become too liberal and to think, oh, it doesn't matter. It's the UK. It's fine. And standards in many areas have slipped. Standards of behavior, standards of actually proudly standing up for who we are and what we stand for. And this is the way we do things. And bluntly, if you don't like it, then there might be plenty of other nice countries that you can go and enjoy a different form of legal system. If you want Sharia law, there's other countries you can go and enjoy that. But that's not the UK.
But this wouldn't cross over into issues of Beth Din, the private Jewish courts, which deal with things about divorce.
No, I mean, obviously, I'm not an expert in that, but that's a private matter, where people are resolving that privately. So my understanding is that's completely different. The issue with Sharia is that it is trying to. There is a sizable minority group of those who practice the Islamic faith who think that Sharia law should be introduced into the United Kingdom, and we should have no place for that.
Just going back to some of the crimes which are committed against Jewish people, and I hear this quite regularly from non-Jewish friends who say, well, when they start attacking us, that's when we start to worry, as if Jewish people are something separate within British society. But as if I use that example, a crime against a Jewish person who's British on the streets of Britain is an attack on all. It's an attack on the society in which we live in. Richard, when is the penny going to drop among the wider community, of which there will be millions of Reform voters who perhaps live in areas which are predominantly white and British, but perhaps don't necessarily see the assault on their country that wasn't there 20 years ago?
Oh, I think people do realise. I think there has been. You're right. Look, there's been a massive wake-up call, and with deep concern and sadness, both at the broader sense of the loss of our culture, the loss of our historical pride in who we are, and also at the rise of open, deep anti-Semitism. That I think that was a horrendous wake-up call. So I think the traditional white British citizen is more than aware. Frankly, if you're not, then you're out of touch. And there are some of those, but I think most people are well aware, and it's I think it's one of the reasons why Reform voters. There used to be quite a lot of shy Reform voters. No one's very shy now, And something is happening out there. And it's almost like a lot of people are saying, you're the last chance.
Finally, Richard, you and Nigel Farage led the vanguard in working with the Damari family to help secure the release of Emily Damari. So this is a personal thank you from me. And what do you know? Tottenham Hotspur won a European trophy. Do you think this is reward from him upstairs for your work? And do you take responsibility for Spurs' win?
No, because I'm a patient Liverpool fan, and so I'm basking in Liverpool's glory until the last couple of matches when I think they took the foot off the gas. But look, I was delighted to ask a pretty punchy question in the House of Commons of the Prime Minister when just after Emily had been released and confirmed that she'd been held in UNRWA facilities, and I asked the PM that's when we should divert aid away from UNRWA. And he didn't like that at all. So it was very nice that I think the Damari family were watching. They'd been made aware that I was going to ask that question. And so, yeah, we're looking forward to meeting them when hopefully we're able to organise that over the summer.
Richard Tice, Deputy Leader of Reform UK, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Thanks for watching Jonny Gould's Jewish State. If you enjoyed this episode, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and tap the bell so you never miss what's next. See you again soon.